confess to you that although I am day by day in this beautiful land, I have the habit of keeping in touch day by day with the news in the land of my birth. And this past week, inescapable, since the 4th of July, day by day, evening by evening, have been reports about the tragic flooding on the Guadalupe River in the center of Texas, where it's a river with hundreds of vacation homes, many long-standing, century and more, summer camps for children. Without any warning, on the night of July 4th, after heavy rain, the river rose almost 40 feet in 20 minutes at around 4 a.m. Presently, over 120 people are dead. 160, almost 170 are still missing. 27 of the dead are girls between the age of 8 and 13 who were part of a camp there called Camp Mystic. It's a scene of end-of-the-world destruction. Whole houses, cars, carried trees uprooted, carried 20 miles down the river. Day by day, what they've been sharing, among other things, are the identity of those who have died and their photographs. Photographs are a blessing, but they're also, when you look into the eyes of those little girls who no longer live in this world, it's overwhelming. I think of that as we hear today the very familiar story Jesus tells of the parable, as we've called it through the centuries, of the Good Samaritan. A lawyer comes to Jesus and asks a question. I've said to you before, questions raised in Scripture are really important. He comes to him, the first question we heard him ask is, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Big question. The answer is right in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. Jesus turns the question to him and says, well, what do you think it is? What do you read in the law? And he gives the right answer. You shall love the Lord your God with heart and mind, soul, breath, and love your neighbor as yourself. And notice Jesus says, you've answered correctly, but then he says, now do it and you will live. Knowing it is not enough. Doing it is the thing that makes it real. There must have been a little sting for the lawyer in that last bit when Jesus said, do it now and you will live, because he then asks another question, which is blessed for us because it gives us this amazing story of the Good Samaritan. He says, well, who is my neighbor? To move forward for a minute, Jesus doesn't answer the question directly. Jesus, in effect, says, by the end of the story, don't ask who your neighbor is. You go out there, walk step by step through your life, and you be neighbor. You intend and will to be neighbor to every person you meet. It's astounding. And he makes the point by telling the story of this poor man who was mugged and beaten and left by the side of the road, potentially dying. And the priest and the Levite are like most people. They were undoubtedly on their way to services they had to lead or something. And in the law, it said, if you come in contact with blood, you must have been bleeding, you cannot do your work in the temple. And if he was dead, the law said if you come in touch with a dead body, you cannot do your work in the temple for a good period of time. So they went right by. The most unlikely person for the hearers of Jesus' story stopped and helped, a Samaritan. Just think of this. There was, at this point, 1,000 years of bad blood between the people of Israel and really their first cousins, the Samaritans. They had come to disdain one another. They had done violence against one another. You recall in John's Gospel, in the 4th chapter, when Jesus comes to the well of Jacob in the middle of the day, and he's hot, and he sits by the well, and the Samaritan woman comes, and she has a pail to get water out of the well, and Jesus says to her, "Would you give me a drink?" She is shocked. She says, "You, a Jew, are talking to me? Speaking to me, a Samaritan woman?" There wouldn't even have been that. This Samaritan, this unlikely person, stops to assist the man in need. And I don't want you to miss, he doesn't just do a little bit. He doesn't call whatever might have been the equivalent of our emergency number in that day, wait for the authorities to come, and then go on his way. No. He stops, he goes to him, he cleans his wounds, takes what he has, which he uses as medicine, wine, so that there's not an infection, oil to give comfort. He bandages him. He puts him up on his own animal that he would have been riding himself, probably a donkey. He brings him to an inn. We don't know how far that was. And then note the next 3 words, the next day. He stayed with him and cared for him wherever he was going overnight. And the next day, he says to the innkeeper, he gives him the equivalent of between, I was going to say dollars, I have to translate again, between 150 and 200 euro. And he says, take care of him now, and when I come back, I'll give you any more than you're owed. He doesn't say, if I come back. This man who is his absolute sworn enemy, he does all that for. He is compassion. He is mercy. And it had to be so challenging for those who heard Jesus speak. Because think about if you were in, God forbid, think about if you were in an accident or fell suddenly ill when you were out in public. And think about, nobody answered this, but think about the last type of person or the last person you would ever want to open your eyes and see first of all. And imagine that's the one person who has cared enough to stop and care for you. 2,100 people have come spontaneously to volunteer along the Guadalupe River this past week to search for those who are still missing. Some of them are family members. They come because they're bonded, right, by love and memory to the person for whom they're looking. But the ones that are like the Good Samaritan, actually, are the ones who know none of the people who are missing or dead. But they come anyway. I was taken over by waves of emotion watching the other night on the news an example of the first type of person. A man in his 30s, picture him, down on his hands and knees in water deep enough, standing water, that you could only see his shoulders and his head. And with his the water is entirely muddy. And with his bare hands, he's reaching down into the water, inch by inch, foot by foot, looking to find the body of his mother. But there's another man, and many like him, who drove miles and miles and miles to come because he heard that the 21-year-old daughter of his friend was missing. He stayed and worked, and that woman was found deceased. Did he go home? No. He's still there. He's staying day after day after day after day to continue to try to help. One thing Jesus' parable makes clear, if you look at the map of the world, the way we write it, You can distinguish countries, huh? We've been taught to do that. You don't even need to see the boundaries to know more or less where they are. What this parable tells us, it's not the only time Jesus tells us this actually, but when God looks at the world, God does not see any borders at all. They are not God's making. They are not part of creation. They are our making. And watching on television this past week, some of the people who came in generosity and are doing all they can to help are wearing Trump 2024 hats. But they're searching for whoever is in need. They're not saying, I'm only looking for the people who think as I do, or look like I do, or worship like I do. A year before his death, Martin Luther King Jr. was speaking at Riverside Church in Manhattan. And he talked about this parable as he addressed the Vietnam War. He said, the parable asks us to realize that ultimately what we're called to do is not simply to rescue the people who have been beat up by the side of the Jericho Road, but to take the Jericho Road and say, why is it making this possible? What is wrong here? What needs to be changed so that people can walk through their life without that kind of suffering, without being beat up and left by the side of the road? A year later, the night before his death, Martin Luther King gave another speech and addressed this parable again. And this time he said, which I think is an amazing insight, he said, the priest and the Levite, as they saw the man that went by, may have been thinking to themselves something like this question: if I help this man, what will happen to me? It was a dangerous place, huh? Where were those robbers who had beaten him up? And once they realized who this was who had been beat up, would they want to be there at all? But Martin Luther King went on to say, for the Good Samaritan, for Jesus, and for us who follow Jesus, that's not the question. The question is, if I do not help this man, what will happen to him? Jesus says at the end of his discussion with this lawyer, he says, go and do likewise. The lawyer answers that last question correct too. Who was the one who was his neighbor? The one who showed him mercy. Go, he says, and do the same. Go and do likewise. I'm going to say something now that I don't mean to offend anybody, because you may have said or heard said what I'm about to say. In 43 years of ministry, hearing loving family members speak at a funeral a word of eulogy for their loved ones, many, many, many times I've heard people say, among many other possibilities, he loved his family and he loved his church. And about 25 years into this life of mine, preaching on this parable again and again and thinking about what it actually says to us, I realized, okay, he loved his family, he loved his church. That's a good start. But that's all it is. God says to us through his Son, much more is asked of us. We are called to be the neighbor to all those around us. And I'll be almost as sharp as the prophet Amos in our first reading today when I say, if I don't, and believe me, I'm not the best in the world in keeping that teaching of the Lord's. But if I don't, if I know that's what God asked of me, and if I know God will give me the strength to do so, and I don't do it over a lifetime, should I expect that I'll be taken into the kingdom at the end, when I haven't willed to live in the kingdom day by day, hour by hour, all my life? One of the ancient desert fathers who lived in the 5th century, I believe, pictured it this way. He said, picture a circle. In the center of the circle is God. And the circumference of the circle are every human life, including ours. Now picture lines going from each human life toward the center, toward God. And he said beautifully, when we come nearer to one another, we become nearer to God. And when we become nearer to God, we become nearer to one another.